The Silent Carolers. It was supposed to be a perfect Christmas retreat. My fiancée, Erica, and I had rented a small cabin in Vermont for the holiday season, far away from the chaos of our city lives. It was nestled in a quiet valley surrounded by dense pine trees, with a postcard view of snow-covered hills. The cabin had charm, an old stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and rustic furniture that looked handmade. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and there was no cell service. The isolation was what sold us on it. We both needed the break. Our first night was uneventful. We decorated a tiny artificial tree we'd brought, drank hot chocolate, and settled in front of the fireplace with a stack of old Christmas movies. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. The next morning, I noticed something odd. On the porch was a line of footprints in the fresh snow, leading to the front door. They were small, like those of a child. "Did you see anyone last night?" I asked Erica. She shook her head, frowning. "Maybe it was some local kid playing in the snow?" The thought of a child wandering alone out here made me uneasy, but the tracks didn't seem to go back into the woods. They stopped at our door. By noon, a fresh snowfall had erased the footprints, and I managed to shrug it off. That evening, as we sat by the fire, there was a soft knock at the door. I looked at Erica, who froze, her mug halfway to her lips. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, rising to my feet. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's out there?" I called, hesitating at the door. There was no response. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, letting in a blast of icy air. The porch was empty. Erica joined me, peering over my shoulder. "It's probably just the wind," she said, though her voice wavered. I stepped outside and scanned the area with a flashlight. The snow was untouched, no footprints leading to or from the cabin. The rest of the evening was tense, but nothing else happened. We went to bed around midnight, though I barely slept. The next night, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder and more insistent. "Don't open it," Erica whispered, clutching my arm. We sat in silence, staring at the door as the knocking continued, relentless and echoing through the cabin. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped abruptly. Then we heard it, a soft, high-pitched voice singing, "Silent night, holy night." The sound was coming from outside the window. Erica let out a gasp and I grabbed the poker from the fireplace. I approached the window slowly, heart pounding. The singing continued, faint and eerie, as if carried by the wind. Peering out into the darkness, I saw them. 4 figures stood in the snow just beyond the porch. They were dressed in old-fashioned winter clothes, their faces pale and blurry, like smudges on glass. They stood perfectly still, their mouths moving in unison as they sang. "Sleep in heavenly peace." Erica pulled me back from the window. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We locked all the doors and windows, though deep down I knew it wouldn't help. The singing continued for hours, the same verse over and over. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The next morning we found more footprints around the cabin, tiny, childlike prints that circled the building repeatedly. Erica wanted to leave, but a snowstorm had rolled in overnight, making the roads impassable. We were trapped. That night the singing returned, louder and closer. This time it was accompanied by scratching at the windows. We sat huddled by the fire, too afraid to move. The voices grew louder, more distorted. They were no longer singing, but chanting, the words garbled and inhuman. Then came the banging. It started at the front door and moved to the windows, each thud rattling the glass. Erica began to cry, her sobs muffled against my shoulder. "Leave us alone," I shouted, though I doubted they could hear me or cared. The noise stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open. I stared in horror as the door swung inward, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. And then they stepped inside. The figures were even more horrifying up close. Their faces were blank slates, featureless and pale, like mannequins. Their clothes dripped with what looked like melted snow, though the air around them was dry. They stood in a line, their heads tilted slightly, as if studying us. Erica screamed, and I raised the fireplace poker, though I knew it was useless. One of them stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Join us," it said, though its mouth didn't move. The room grew unbearably cold, frost creeping up the walls. I could feel my breath freezing in my lungs. Then Erica collapsed. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, it was morning. The fire had gone out and Erica was lying beside me, unconscious but breathing. The door was closed, though there were no signs of it having been forced. We left that day, abandoning our belongings in the cabin. We never spoke about what happened, not to each other or anyone else. But every year, as Christmas approaches, I hear them in my dreams, the soft, haunting voices of the carolers, and I know they're still out there waiting for someone else to sing along. The Christmas doll. It all started with a package left on our porch, 1 week before Christmas. My wife, Rose, and I were spending the holiday season in a rented cabin near the Appalachian Mountains, hoping for a peaceful getaway. We had no neighbors for miles, and the snow-covered forest surrounding the cabin looked like something out of a postcard. The package wasn't addressed to anyone. It was small, wrapped in faded red paper with a gold ribbon tied neatly on top. "Did you order something?" Rose asked, holding it up. I shook my head. "Not me. Maybe the landlord left it for us." Rose shrugged and brought it inside. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to open it. Inside was an antique porcelain doll. It wore a tattered green dress trimmed with lace, and its painted face had an unsettling smile. One of its glass eyes was slightly off-center, giving it a crooked, almost knowing expression. "Why would someone leave this here?" Rose asked, clearly unnerved. "Maybe it's a local tradition," I joked, though the doll made my skin crawl. Rose placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, muttering something about it being creepy but harmless. That night, we were woken by a soft thud. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The cabin was silent, save for the wind howling outside. "What was that?" Rose whispered. "I'll check," I said, grabbing a flashlight. The sound had come from the living room. When I got there, I froze. The doll was no longer on the mantel. It was lying on the floor, face down. I picked it up and inspected it. Nothing seemed broken. "Probably just fell," I muttered, though the mantel wasn't particularly high, and the doll had been placed securely. I put it back and returned to bed, dismissing the incident as nothing. The next day, we decided to go for a hike. When we came back, the doll had moved again. It was now sitting on the coffee table, its head tilted to face the front door. "Did you move it?" I asked Rose, my voice sharper than I intended. "No," she said, staring at the doll with wide eyes. "You don't think someone broke in, do you?" We searched the cabin from top to bottom. The doors were locked, the windows secured, and there were no signs of forced entry. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows, set my nerves on edge. At around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint giggle coming from the living room. I nudged Rose awake. "Do you hear that?" She listened, her face pale. "It sounds like a child." We grabbed a flashlight and crept into the living room. The doll was gone. My pulse thundered in my ears as I searched the room. Rose found it first. It was sitting upright on the floor, facing the fireplace. Its head was turned just slightly, as if it had been watching us approach. "This isn't funny," Rose said, her voice trembling. "I didn't do this," I snapped, equally terrified. We decided to lock the doll in a cupboard. Out of sight, out of mind, or so we hoped. But things only got worse. The next morning, we found tiny footprints in the snow outside the cabin. They led from the woods to our front porch and stopped there. "Maybe an animal?" Rose suggested, though we both knew better. That night, the knocking started. It was soft at first, a faint tap, tap, tap on the windows. Then it grew louder, more insistent. We didn't dare look outside. The knocking moved from window to window, circling the cabin. Then we heard the giggling again, louder this time, echoing through the walls. "It's the doll," Rose whispered, clutching my arm. "It's just a toy," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. The cupboard door slammed open with a deafening bang. We screamed as the doll tumbled out, landing upright on the floor. "Get rid of it!" Rose shouted, her voice breaking. I grabbed the doll and ran outside, ignoring the biting cold. I hurled it into the snow and watched as it disappeared into the darkness of the forest. When I came back inside, Rose was sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. "Do you think it's over?" she asked. "I hope so," I said, though I wasn't convinced. The next morning, we found it back on the mantel. Its dress was damp, covered in mud and pine needles, but its crooked smile was as pristine as ever. That night, we packed our bags and left. We never spoke of the doll again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint knocking at the windows. And when I close my eyes, I can see that twisted smile staring back at me in the dark. The Frostwalker. It was supposed to be a quiet Christmas in a rented cabin tucked deep in the Rockies. No neighbors, no Wi-Fi. Just me and my girlfriend Anna, escaping the chaos of our busy lives. Snow blanketed the ground in soft layers, and the towering pines whispered in the winter wind. We arrived on December 22nd, the cabin barely visible through the flurry of snowflakes. The place was old, built of heavy logs that groaned against the weight of time and weather. A single stone fireplace dominated the living room, and the only light came from flickering oil lamps that gave the space an eerie, uneven glow. It was perfect, or so we thought. The first night I woke to the sound of crunching. At first I thought it was the wind shifting the snow outside, but as I listened closer, it sounded deliberate. Slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I nudged Anna awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She groggily sat up, listening. The crunching stopped. "It's probably an animal," she mumbled, pulling the blankets tighter around her. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to panic her. I peeked out the window, but the swirling snow made it impossible to see more than a few feet. The next morning, I found tracks in the snow. They weren't like any animal prints I'd ever seen, long, narrow impressions that looked almost human, except for the clawed toes. They circled the cabin once before disappearing into the forest. "Maybe it's a bear?" Anna suggested, though her tone was uncertain. "Bears don't leave tracks like this," I said, unease curling in my gut. We decided to stay inside for the day, lighting the fireplace and trying to enjoy the isolation. But that evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, the cabin's atmosphere shifted. The wind grew louder, almost howling, and the oil lamps flickered violently. Anna was in the kitchen when she called out, her voice sharp with fear. "Liam, come here!" I rushed in to find her staring at the frosted window above the sink. Words were scrawled in the frost, long streaks cutting through the condensation. "I see you." We both froze, staring at the window. "That wasn't there earlier," Anna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's just a prank," I said, though my pulse was racing. "A prank? Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere?" She was right. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, and the cabin was surrounded by untouched forest. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't circle the cabin. They stopped directly outside the bedroom window. I held my breath, listening. Anna clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. The footsteps didn't move. Then a slow, deliberate tapping on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. "Don't look," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. But I couldn't help myself. I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse of the window. A pale, gaunt face stared back at me. Its skin was translucent, the veins beneath it black and pulsing. Its eyes were pure white, glowing faintly in the darkness. I screamed and the figure disappeared, the tapping ceasing instantly. The next morning we debated leaving, but a heavy snowstorm had rolled in overnight and the cabin was completely snowed in. There was no way out until the weather cleared. That evening we barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, piling furniture against the door. We kept the fireplace burning and stayed huddled under the blankets, the weight of the night pressing down on us. At around midnight, the sound of scratching began. It came from the walls, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the room to the other. "Liam," Anna whispered, her voice shaking. "I know," I said, gripping her hand tightly. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then it stopped. We held our breath, listening. The window shattered. Glass sprayed across the room as the freezing wind rushed in. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of the figure crawling through the broken frame, its long, spindly limbs bending in unnatural angles. "Run!" I shouted, dragging Anna out of bed. We burst out of the room, the barricade toppling behind us. The creature let out a guttural screech, its voice like ice cracking beneath heavy boots. We grabbed our coats and boots, fumbling to put them on as we stumbled toward the door. The creature was fast, its footsteps echoing behind us. We managed to get outside, the icy wind biting at our skin. The snow was knee-deep, slowing us down, but the creature seemed unhindered. As we ran, I noticed something strange. The forest ahead of us was glowing faintly, an otherworldly light seeping through the trees. "Keep going," I shouted, pulling Anna along. The light grew brighter until we stumbled into a clearing. At its center was an ancient stone altar, covered in frost and surrounded by symbols carved into the ground. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, screeching in rage. It couldn't cross the symbols. We didn't question it. We stayed in the clearing until dawn, the creature pacing along the edge, its pale face contorted with fury. When the sun rose, it disappeared into the forest, leaving only the faint echo of its scream behind. We left the cabin that morning, abandoning everything but our lives. I don't know what we saw or why it let us go, but I still dream of those white eyes, staring through the frost, watching, waiting.
Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.